Hi Internet, my name is Ash, also known as Force of Habit. I make video games, YouTube videos, and I also make a Discord bot, which tracks game coverage over the Internet. In October last year, I flew out to Graz in Austria to Game Dev Days conference to give my first ever talk, all things game feel. Game feel is one of my favourite things in game development, and having made games for about 7 years now, I feel knowledgeable enough and comfortable enough to give a talk on the topic. Since the recording is not online yet, I figured I'd give the talk again, this time for you on YouTube. It is 30 minutes long, however, so if you are strapped for time, hit subscribe down below and come back later. I'll be covering game feel again in a future video. Without further ado, let's get started. First up is a little bit about myself and Force of Habit. I've probably been making things on computers since before I could type, but I've otherwise been making games professionally as Force of Habit since 2012. I'm a programmer by trade, but I do art, music, marketing, and pretty much everything else I need to sustain myself as a studio. I love to experiment. I take part in lots of game jams, Ludum Dare, Global Game Jam, and so on. I try to push my boundaries whenever I can, and I'm primarily interested in games with strong, unique movement mechanics. If you know any of my games at all, you'll probably be able to tell all that. If you don't know any of my games, my most popular game is Toast Time, a game where you play a toaster, fire bread and breakfast items out of your head, use recoil to move around, and defend Monday morning breakfast time in the process. Name any bread, bagels, baguettes, croutons, crumpets, it's in there. It's a bit mad. It's on mobile and Nintendo Switch if you want to check it out. I also made a logic puzzle game called Make Nines, and a whole bunch of other things. Here is a quick video of some of those things. So, all of the games you just saw are built in my own custom C++ game engine. A career of building games from the ground up has taught me so much about how digital objects are formed, how they move, and how they interact together. Nothing has been built for me, so I've had to dive deep into understanding and analysing everything at its lowest level, and then work my way up. For my talk today, I will draw from those experiences, provide some nice demonstrations of polish and juice, and hopefully show how everything relates to game feel. These are the topics I'm going to cover. I should say I'm not necessarily trying to teach you anything new in these areas, but instead I'm trying to make you consider things you might not have considered previously, or to make you think about things a little bit differently or more deeply. First up, a quick introduction to game feel. What is game feel? Game feel is a term and set of rules coined by Steve Swink in his book aptly titled Game Feel. Swink himself says there's no standard definition of game feel and that it's different for everyone. That is to say, it's kind of subjective. Generally though, it's about virtual sensation and immersion. It's impossible to summarise the entire book into a single slide, of course, but if I were to try to define game feel from my perspective, I'd say it's about these 4 things. First, it's about player experience, interacting with the game on a tactile, kinesthetic level, having low-level latency and highly sensitive input controls. It's about speed, pacing, difficulty, flow, and the second-to-second experience. Secondly, it's about player feedback, dispelling the existing beliefs a player has of how a game should behave, and communicating game events effectively to immerse the player. Third, it's about player connection, giving everything context and meaning to amplify understanding. It's about creating your own design language and metaphor within your game. Ultimately though, for me, it's all about motion, tying things together, and making them fun. If you can make it fun to do the most menial action there is in your game, you're onto a winner. If you're interested in how you can quantify some of these things, you should definitely check out Steve Swink's book. Making things fun starts with the perception of the player. It's all in the feedback loop. This is the game feedback loop. I'll be surprised if you've not seen something like this before. Player makes input, game makes pixel output, repeat. Pretty simple. So I'd like to fill it out a little bit more thoroughly. This is the same as before, but with a few things added. The player brings culture and experience, and the game is now broken down into layers. Movement, camera, effects, and UI. When I first start playing a game, this is generally the order in which I begin to understand it. These are roughly the same topics as listed in the intro, so these are the things I will talk about. Note I've moved the game into a sandbox area in the diagram, because when you're concentrating on game feel, you can kind of ignore everything except the core mechanics, the interactions and the sounds. There are a few things to consider first with input. Things like player jump should be on key down, not on the key up. This might be obvious, but some internet tutorials have got it wrong. You should never follow instructions blindly. On the contrary, for UI buttons, the existing paradigm is that the main event is cancelable on mouse out. Communicate the states, mouse over, mouse down, etc., however you choose, and always obey the paradigms. Lastly, all valid input should have obvious visible outcomes. If the player can't tell when they've pressed a button, they might press it again, and you will get an unexpected result. Consider your controller dead zones. Controllers send values between -1 and +1 when wriggling the analog sticks. Old, worn or bad controllers will have a slightly offset rest position. This will result in undesired input, sometimes known as drift. I'd recommend at least 25% as an inner dead zone, but you should make it customizable if you can. I would also recommend clamping or culling values outside a length of 1 as an outer dead zone. Your engine might handle this for you, but it's worth checking. Moving on to movement now. And the first thing in movement that I would like to talk about is micro-acceleration. Micro-acceleration is a term I've coined where I take a stiff moving object and add very small, very subtle accelerative movement. It's one of those things where you wouldn't notice when it is there, but you would notice when it's not. Let me demonstrate. Here is a very simple player movement. The player presses a key and hits max speed immediately. The player releases a key and returns to 0 speed immediately. You can see on the right, if the player tries to move in an exact square, they will move in an exact square. It's kind of stiff. Here is an accelerative player movement. The player holds a key and the speed value increases gradually over time until they hit max speed. The player releases a key and returns to 0 gradually too. You can see on the right, if the player tries to move in an exact square, they will move in a very rounded rectangle shape. It feels kind of slippery. Here is micro-acceleration. The code is the same as before, but the acceleration value has been increased by 15 times. As a result, the player hits max speed very, very, very quickly. The idea with micro-acceleration is to hit max speed within a few frames. The result is subtle and feels nice. I use this in most of my games in some way, shape or form. But what else feels nice? Adding principles of motion feels nice. Things like squash, stretch, anticipation and exaggeration. Here I've taken the player from the previous example, made them rectangular for some reason, and put them in a platformer. On the left is a normal jumping square. In the middle I've added squash and stretch. I'm sure you'll agree it's really much better. On the right I've exaggerated the squash and stretch and made the landing exaggerated too. Definitely look up the principles of animation or the principles of motion and implement them into your games. Next up is easing. To think about easing, we have to think about objects in real life. Objects in real life don't move at a constant speed. Well, except for time and the speed of light, but we can't really perceive those. Think about kicking a ball down the road. It moves fast at first, rolls for a while, and then slows down and eventually comes to a stop. Easing functions allow you to do things a bit like that. Easing gives you nice movements and nice curves. On a technical level, really, they just specify the rate of change of a value over time. And there are so many to choose from. And you can design your own. I use them literally everywhere in my games. They are usually available as part of a tweening library, so get your hands on a tweening library in your engine of choice. Here are some examples of things moving with easings. They look good. Next, I'll show you how I use easings in my games. As I was saying, objects don't move at a constant speed in real life, so why should they in games? Make an object go fast at the start and slow at the end. A great use case of this is a dash attack. Next, continuity. Continuity is a word I use to describe things transitioning smoothly, and not just flash appearing or disappearing in a single frame. When objects spawn, I apply easing to their size to maintain continuity. I start at 0 size and scale up to the regular object size. You can see the enemy spawning on the left there. This one is for programmers with basic art skills, like me. You can make things seem more alive with easing on movement. Make things waddle, bobble, or flutter. If it's good enough for South Park, it's good enough for us. It might be obvious, I use easing for camera tweens. Everybody does. These are the most common ones, out easing and in-out easing. Wobbly wobbly, I like it when things wobble. This is scale and rotation with offset and delay. It's over the top, but hey. This is a stranger one that's harder to visualize. I sometimes apply easing to controller inputs. This is useful in the case that you want lighter touches to register as slower movement speed. For example, if the player is crouching or sneaking around. Full movement is achieved at full stick distance, the same as usual. The next slide has an epilepsy warning. Look away for about 5 seconds. Here is an example of using easing all over the place and all at once. Shape, color, size, etc. Sorry. Easing functions, honestly, are one of my favourite things. But what else does easing achieve? Using easing adds personality to your game. It makes your game charming. It makes the movement feel so much more real. Designing with specific movements is design language and allows you to create your own recognizable motifs. If your game has pickups and you make all of them wiggle in a certain way, a player will immediately recognize what is and is not a pickup. That is the power of the design language. I wanted to talk about periodic functions like sine, cosine, tangent, but I won't really have time. Let's skip. Just know that you can use them for moving things in swirly patterns, for modulation, and for things like generating meshes. Get comfortable with maths if you can. Next I want to talk about cameras. Now, player controls and camera controls are often intertwined. When you move the player, the camera often moves in some way too. This means the game feel is affected by both. It doesn't really matter what type of camera you have. It can be a single screen or fixed camera, a box camera or a camera trap, a vertical camera, a look-ahead camera, or any other type of camera. What matters is how you transition the camera between different states. There are considerations. Imagine you have a 2D platformer where the camera is always in front of the player. When the player turns around facing left, the camera needs to move to show what's ahead. If the camera transition is too fast, it would feel kind of harsh, jarring and disorienting for the player. If it moves too slowly, the player might miss vital information and get hit by, say, a projectile. Let's imagine the player gets hit. The camera shakes. When thinking about camera shake, it's important to consider why you're shaking the camera. For most cases, you're shaking the camera to visualize a disturbance of air between the gameplay action and the camera, for example, explosions. In other cases, it might be to suggest when the character is in a bad way, headaches, tinnitus, experiencing loud noises like alarms. In both cases, it's appropriate movement design that helps sell the experience as real. So you'll probably want some camera shake, otherwise you end up with this. Hilarious, but kind of bad if it were in a game. I've seen a few different methods of implementing camera shakes, which I'll talk about now. The first is this noise shake. It's fine, especially for a retro style game, but it feels more like static than, say, an explosion, or, as is the case in this GIF, a big rock hitting the floor. The second is similar to the first, but a smoother experience. The camera will move in a pattern over time, usually a circular pattern or a Mobius loop type pattern. The shake will be stronger in the beginning and weaker at the end. No doubt this is achieved using easing functions. A third shake adds rotation to the mix. I've used this in my own game Neon Caves, but I found it's very important to keep this one subtle. The player can find it disorienting and even nauseous if it's applied too heavily. Ick. The final shake I want to talk about is an axis locked shake. Now I'm not sure if I've said so far that motion is meaningful, but well, one of my beliefs is that all motion is meaningful.
And this point is eloquently made by this camera shake example. If camera shake is restricted to horizontal movement, it's kind of like a person shaking their head. It's negative feedback. You generally see this in password dialogues when you get it wrong, but you could equally use vertical shake to suggest positive feedback, because it's like me nodding or jumping for joy. So, there are multiple ways of shaking the camera. None of them are inherently bad, they all just convey different meanings. You should think about which you want to use. In my view, the best camera shake is one that can handle everything mixed together. That means multiple layers from different game events, and multiple forms like rotation and noise. See this timeline graphic here. Now, a few quick tips. Don't shake your entire screen, and don't shake your interface. You might notice I've not been calling it screen shake all this time. If you do choose to shake your UI, use a subtle parallax effect. Number 2. Design around an extended game world. I've had it before where a designer makes a graphic that only fits one screen size, which when applying shake would leave gaps. If you ever have this scenario, make sure you can plug the gap somehow. The image on the right is an example that would probably be unnoticeable. I should say I'm not ripping on this game, these are all in development GIFs. Sorry, Kamizoto. Number 3, and this might be the first time you've heard this, maybe consider using less camera shake? If, for example, you have a local multiplayer game, and one player performs an action that causes a really big shake, let's say an explosion, the other players might not have realised yet what's going on, and they might lose sight of their characters. This would negatively affect their perception of the game, and that would be bad. Moving on to effects now, and first we're going to talk about particles. Particles! Everybody loves particles. We all know we can use particles to polish a game and to create satisfying rewards, but how can we make our particles better? I have a few concepts to consider. The first of which is randomness versus curation. Look at this GIF and think about which looks better. The one on the left is random and the one on the right is curated. And what do I mean by this? Well, with the one on the left, the particles spawn at completely random X positions within the tile. With the one on the right, the particles have predefined spawn positions that are looped through sequentially. The curated random has fewer particles clumping and clustering together. I think it looks better, do you? Here is the same principle applied to explosion particles. The one on the left spawns particles at random angles between 0 and 360 degrees. The one on the right spawns particles at 45-degree intervals with a slight random offset on each. As before, less clumping together, it looks better. Think about a fireworks display. It wouldn't look like the one on the left, it would look like the one on the right, right? This is the same explosion as before on the previous slide, but I've added easing to the speed and the size. It's better still. Anyway, pure random isn't all that bad. It's easy to get going, and it looks pretty good. It's always my first go-to, but it's not always aesthetically pleasing. So add more thought, more design, more curation, and add more easing where you can. But random is okay sometimes. You just have to experiment. Experiment with all the parameters, size, speed, rotation, and so on, until you have something that looks good. Experiment with weighted randoms and normally distributed randoms. That just means a bell curve. Values in the middle of the bell curve are selected more often. Those are my top 2 recommendations. On to continuity now, and I spoke a bit about continuity earlier. It applies here too with the particles, mostly when particles are spawned when objects are removed, like when an enemy dies. On the left, the bird is removed at the same time as the explosion spawn. On the right, it waits a little. There should be no frames where things are visibly removed. If you don't have continuity, you have discontinuity, which breaks connection and immersion. Hopefully you can see the one on the right is better. Maybe none of this is actually going to be visible once it's uploaded to YouTube. I guess we'll see. My way of improving continuity is to use jibs. Jibs, jibs, jibs. Make everything explode into thousands of tiny pieces for a fun time. Also, collisions. Add collisions to your particles and to your jibs. This will make them seem more real and more believable. And it looks cool when they collide and bounce around on things. Everybody likes that. The next topic is transitions, which I think instantly improves your look and feel. Generally by transitions here, I mean things which cover the entire screen while the gameplay state changes underneath. Transitions ideally are really snappy, so like 1 second at most. I'll run through some examples. Fading to colour is the simplest one. I use this one in lots of my jam games. It's really easy because you just fill the screen with a colour and then remove that colour afterwards. Another easy one is to cover the screen with lots of tiny squares. It's definitely most suited to retro games, but it doesn't have to be. This transition is actually quite versatile and has some other great ideas in it. The transition moves with the players. When the players move up off the screen, the squares move up, and when the players move down off the screen, the squares move down. This is achieved again using offsets and delays. Another thing retro games do is throw some lines across the screen because why not? It's retro. But you can be a lot more thoughtful than that, at least I hope. Here is a transition from Doom. It's a bit like the lines across the screen, right? Except I think the idea here is to suggest blood dripping down the screen. Doom is full of blood and gore, and this transition amplifies that. So yeah, if you can theme your transitions to your game, even better. These should take precedence over other generic transitions. In this example, the second state is meant to be a kind of theatre. The curtains opening and closing is just like the theatre. It makes sense. This is Final Fantasy VIII. The transition into battle is kind of an additive blend to Dream. If you've played Final Fantasy VIII, the dreaminess of this transition kind of makes sense. I might be reading into things a bit too much, but that's kind of the point. You should be too. Be a bit more imaginative. Find inspiration from anywhere and everywhere. Maybe take hints from movie software, but also maybe don't because they're kind of bad. Just think outside the box a bit. Anyhow, if you put everything we've gone through so far together, you end up with something really nice and really seamless, like this amazing menu system in the game Torbs. You can see every navigation move event is communicated through animation and motion. Objects move out of the way, rotating. There is a spike thing in the corner with some mesh deforming maths. It's over gratuitous, but it's really great. Just look at it. Next, I want to talk about text and dialogue. In written word, at least in English, we have things like bold, italic, underline, punctuation for different reasons. Bold is used to draw the eye. Italic is used for emphasis. Capital letters are used for, ironically, small print legal text, and of course, shouting on the internet. In the digital realm, though, we have so many more options. We can go way beyond emphasis. What kind of things am I talking about? Flaming text, of course. Set everything on fire. Not really. In seriousness, though, we can use text effects to evoke feelings and to make players feel more connected to a game and to its characters. We can use subtle movement and slow delivery speed to give the player a sense of what's to come. Kind of ominous. On the flip side, we can use fast delivery speed to show excitement or panic. We can give a character a larger font size to show shouting, ignorance or singing, and to make the player feel ignored. We can use small, grayed out text to show an inner monologue or some whispering between characters to make the player feel more connected and included in the game world. We can add shake to the text to make something feel spooky or to make the player feel wary. Though, in this case, it's just because the character is a skeleton, also sitting on a wobbly washing machine. So of course it would be shaky. We can use multiple colours and gradients on individual text characters to form a rainbow effect. This could show excitement or happiness, and so make the player feel those things. We can use colour, movement, and camera shake for humour to make the player laugh. This looks cool, it gets the message across, it's humorous. It's had many thousands of retweets, so do things like this. Take a page from their book. We can use glitched text to make something seem broken or dysfunctional, to suggest it needs fixing, or to confuse the player into thinking their computer is broken. Finally, in this example from Call of Duty, well, I used to think this text countdown was lazy and could have been better, but what better way to symbolise the depravity and bleakness of war? There is nothing better than a simple scale of a text. In summary, for text effects, you should think about what different effects can deliver in terms of emotions and feelings. Getting this right will connect players with characters more deeply, above the kinesthetic, tactile, game feel level, and it looks awesome too. Sometimes. Just a few loose ends now because I want to wrap up. Tip number 1, always have something moving on screen. It doesn't really matter what it is, it can be a button pulsing, an object moving, or just some flashing arcade-style press start text. The player might think your game has crashed if you haven't done this. 2. Follow principles of motion when designing your UI. You can see here all of the principles when it comes to UI. Offset and delay are my favourites as discussed previously, but all of these are equally important. 3. Always follow visual hierarchy. If players understand things in the wrong order, they could make the wrong decisions. Hopefully you read what's on the screen in the right order, not the wrong order. 4. Make your game forgiving. If you're making a platformer and focusing on something that isn't hardcore platforming, for example, combat, make sure the platforming doesn't get in the way. Make sure it's not frustrating. If you know the player is trying to jump up onto a platform, make them grab the ledge and just push them up. Understand and account for their intentions. Make it forgiving, make it fluid, make it joyful. 5. Make chain reactions. People love chain reactions. Even Candy Crush has chain reactions. If you have explosions, make explosions make explosions. 6. Consider what should happen when there is no input. Some games have an attract mode happen. This is especially good for showcasing at events like Game Dev Days. My favourite example though is in Sonic the Hedgehog. He looks bored and starts tapping his foot impatiently when there is no input. It gives him extra personality. 7. This is more of an animation thing. Use a.k.a. inverse kinematics. Look how lovely this is. 8. Last of all is to always ask why, especially when it comes to polish. If everything is full of visual flair, moving, animated, juiced, lovely, then effectively nothing is juiced because nothing will stand out. The player communication you've gone about designing is rendered ineffective. So maybe think before adding that chromatic aberration. We're at the end now, so just a quick recap over what I've said are the most important things. Make it feel fun to walk around, to jump, and to hit things. If you're not making a game where you can move a character around, make it fun to move your cursor over things. If you can make your UI fun to use, it doesn't really matter if your game is fun. Make it fun to do the most boring thing there is to do, and make everything fun using exaggerated and extravagant motion. If you'd like to know more about game feel or anything else I've mentioned today, I've included some extra material here. Here are some links for extra reading, which obviously you can't click right now, but these links are down in the description. And I'm going to leave with one final thing, and this is my deepest belief. That little thing taking up loads of time that nobody will notice, they will notice. On a subconscious level, they will notice. Fill your games with all the love, care and attention that you have. If you fill your game with love, players will feel the love, and the love will be reciprocated.
Thanks so much for listening, peeps. If you found any of that useful, please follow my game development on social media. It's @ForceHabit. If you want to be extra nice, you can subscribe down below and also check out my Patreon. That'd be really, really nice. I also have a Discord if you have any questions. Alternatively, you can leave a comment down below. All the links and handles are on screen. And thank you so much for listening again, and I'll catch you next time.